December 17, 1944, the Ardennes Forest, Belgium. Obergefreiter Hans Mueller crouched in his frozen foxhole, writing words in his diary that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The Americans are not like the Russians. Their artillery is something else entirely. It is not the volume of fire, though that is terrible enough. It is the speed, it is the accuracy. It is the knowledge that you have no time to react. One moment there is silence, the next moment the world explodes. That foggy morning, through the thick mist that blanketed the forest floor and reduced visibility to mere meters, Mueller witnessed something that destroyed every belief German troops maintained about American military prowess. His battalion, belonging to the Sixth SS Panzer Army, had just initiated Hitler's ultimate Western gamble, a desperate operation designed to split the Allied forces and capture the vital port of Antwerp. They had secured total surprise against weakly defended American positions that intelligence had assured them were held by inexperienced troops. Triumph appeared imminent in those opening hours when German forces surged forward through the snow-covered terrain. Then American artillery located them with a precision that seemed almost supernatural. What Mueller didn't realize, what no German warrior advancing through those snow-blanketed forests could have understood, was that they were about to face the deadliest artillery apparatus ever fielded in combat. An apparatus so sophisticated, so destructive, and so accurately synchronized that it would shatter the spine of Germany's final attack and expose the genuine magnitude of American military dominance. This was not merely superior firepower. This was an entirely new paradigm of warfare that represented the culmination of American industrial might, technological innovation, and systematic military organization. The disintegration had commenced well before the Bulge battle. During 1943 and 1944, German veterans relocated from the Eastern Front to confront American troops in Italy, France, and the Low Countries brought with them beliefs formed in desperate struggles against Soviet bombardment. These were hardened warriors who had survived the brutal campaigns at Stalingrad, Kursk, and countless other Eastern battles. They had mastered surviving Russian barrages through brutal first-hand knowledge acquired at terrible cost over months and years of continuous combat. The Russians would launch ranging rounds, providing German forces vital moments to find shelter. The projectiles would land in foreseeable sequences, permitting movement between volleys. The fire coordination was frequently sluggish, requiring 10 to 15 minutes from spotting to detonation. This predictability, while still deadly, allowed experienced soldiers to develop survival tactics based on recognizing patterns and exploiting the time gaps inherent in Soviet artillery procedures. The Americans were unlike them, frighteningly unlike them in every conceivable way. Gefreiter Otto Schmidt, a 2-year Eastern Front veteran who bore the scars of multiple campaigns, seized with the Africa Corps in Tunisia during May 1943, would subsequently recount his initial experience with American bombardment in a post-war conversation conducted by military historians seeking to understand the German perspective on Allied capabilities. We had established position in a wadi north of Tunis, a natural ravine that offered excellent concealment from aerial observation and good protection against horizontal fire. Solid protection, we believed, based on our extensive combat experience. The Russians would have required an hour to locate us and another hour to calibrate their weapons. We felt secure enough to warm our morning coffee, to relax momentarily in the false security that our experience had taught us to trust. Then we observed it. A tiny aircraft no larger than a reconnaissance plane buzzing overhead at roughly 500 meters altitude, flying a lazy circular pattern above our position. We scarcely noticed. Such aircraft carried no armament. We presumed it was conducting photography, routine reconnaissance that posed no immediate threat to our well-concealed position. 3 minutes afterward, without alert, without ranging rounds, without any indication whatsoever that we had been targeted, the complete wadi detonated in an eruption of fire and steel that defied everything we understood about artillery operations. Projectiles landing concurrently, not in succession, a violation of every principle of artillery fire we had learned. Air explosions above us, ground explosions among us, creating a three-dimensional killing zone from which there was no escape. Within 30 seconds, my company terminated as a combat formation. I was among 11 survivors from 123 personnel. The speed, the precision, the overwhelming violence of that barrage exceeded anything I had experienced in 2 years of brutal combat on the Eastern Front. The aircraft Schmidt had spotted was an L-4 Grasshopper, the American Forward Observer's aerial platform. These modest Piper Cubs, civilian aircraft adapted for military reconnaissance, would transform into the most dreaded aircraft in the German military. Not for any armament they transported, but for what accompanied their presence. These unassuming planes became harbingers of death, their appearance overhead a virtually certain guarantee of imminent artillery fire. German warriors discovered a harsh reality that spread through their ranks like a plague of fear. When you spotted a grasshopper overhead, you possessed minutes, possibly only seconds, before American bombardment converted your location into a killing ground. This knowledge created a psychological terror that was almost as debilitating as the physical destruction that followed. Leutnant Friedrich Bauer, an artillery commander who had managed counter-battery operations on the Eastern Front with considerable success, documented his amazement in correspondence uncovered decades afterward in German military files stored in captured archives. I examined American artillery methods from seized documents, technical manuals captured during operations that detailed their procedures with remarkable thoroughness. At first, I suspected these documents were misinformation, propaganda crafted to frighten us and exaggerate American capabilities. No artillery apparatus could function as outlined. The synchronization demanded would be unachievable with any system we understood or could imagine implementing. Then I observed it personally near St. Lo during the Normandy campaign. An American Grasshopper materialized above our carefully concealed gun position. We monitored it, preparing to relocate our weapons as routine protocol dictated, a maneuver we had practiced countless times. Before we could shift, before we had even calculated firing information for counter-battery operations, a process that normally required several minutes even for our most experienced crews, American projectiles were impacting our location with devastating accuracy. Not arbitrary fire, not zone saturation hoping to hit something through volume alone, but precise fire on each weapon. They had determined firing calculations for multiple batteries, synchronized multiple batteries at various distances, and executed simultaneous fire in less duration than it required our own forward spotters to transmit map references to our Fire Coordination Center. The mathematical complexity and organizational coordination this required seemed beyond human capability. The key to American artillery dominance resided not in a solitary breakthrough, but in a thorough apparatus that combined technology, instruction, and industrial capability at a magnitude Germany could never equal. It was a system, not a weapon, that defeated us. The cornerstone was the Fire Direction Center, an idea that transformed artillery utilization in fundamental ways that revolutionized battlefield operations. Where German artillery batteries computed firing calculations independently, with each battery operating as a separate entity requiring its own observations and calculations, American batteries transmitted all information to a central fire direction center that could synchronize fire from numerous batteries concurrently. This centralization multiplied effectiveness exponentially. The FDC apparatus relied on pre-computed firing charts that represented years of peacetime preparation. In facilities throughout the United States, in offices from Washington to California, chambers filled with women, many of them mathematicians and engineers, labored with mechanical calculators, slide rules, and logarithm charts computing firing calculations for every imaginable combination of factors: wind velocity and bearing, temperature variations, moisture content in the air, barrel deterioration from repeated firing, propellant temperature affecting burning rates, elevation differences between weapon and objective across varied terrain. These charts, published in volumes compact enough to transport in a map container, yet comprehensive enough to cover virtually any battlefield scenario, permitted American fire direction commanders to determine precise firing calculations in minutes instead of hours. The computational work had been completed in advance, transformed into reference tables that could be consulted in seconds. Hauptmann Werner Hoffmann, a mathematics instructor with advanced degrees drafted into the Wehrmacht artillery, studied captured American firing charts following the war with professional fascination. His examination, maintained in German military documents now declassified, disclosed his astonished respect for the achievement they represented. These charts embody years of computational labor, thousands upon thousands of hours on mechanical calculators performing calculations with precision that would have required our best mathematicians weeks to replicate. They had determined calculations for every factor we might face in combat, every variable that could affect trajectory and impact. Our own firing charts were primitive by comparison, demanding extensive battlefield computations for each assignment, calculations performed under pressure by officers who might be under fire themselves. The Americans had completed the mathematics beforehand in the quiet of peacetime laboratories. In combat, they merely referenced the solution, converting a complex mathematical problem into a simple table lookup. Yet, charts alone couldn't account for American artillery's crushing effectiveness. The genuine transformation was time on target, a firing method so sophisticated that few nations held the ability to implement it even decades after the war's conclusion. Time on target, universally recognized as TOT, synchronized artillery fire, so that projectiles from multiple batteries launched at different moments based on their proximity from the objective arrived concurrently within a 3-second interval. The mathematical complexity required to calculate the precise firing moment for each battery, accounting for the different flight times based on range and trajectory, was staggering. The consequence was devastating beyond anything conventional artillery could achieve. German warriors experienced no alert, no ranging rounds, no progressive intensification of fire that would allow them to take cover. One instant, quiet. The following instant, numerous projectiles detonating simultaneously in a thunderclap of destruction that arrived with the suddenness of lightning. Forces in the open, whose survival against traditional artillery relied on diving prone at the initial explosion, a technique drilled into every soldier through countless training exercises, possessed no opportunity to respond. The first explosion in a TOT barrage was accompanied by dozens of others, eliminating the warning that soldiers depended upon for survival. Research performed after the war by military analysts studying casualty patterns disclosed that 66% of artillery fatalities happened in the opening moments of a bombardment. Time on target optimized casualties by removing warning, by maximizing the number of shells that detonated before soldiers could react. Stabsfeldwebel Kurt Zimmermann, who endured TOT attacks during the Bulge battle and survived through luck more than skill, documented in his diary, seized by American troops in a captured headquarters, his inability to comprehend what he was experiencing. It is not bombardment as we comprehend it. It is something novel, something that violates every principle of artillery we learned in training and refined through years of combat experience. You detect nothing, no warning whistle of incoming shells, no preliminary ranging shots. Then existence terminates. every projectile arrives in the identical moment, creating an instantaneous hell. The air explosions eliminate personnel who would survive ground explosions. The ground explosions eliminate personnel who would survive air explosions. There is no opportunity to leap for shelter, no opportunity to reach a depression, no opportunity even to fall flat. You are merely alive one instant and injured or deceased the next, with no transition, no chance to fight or flee or save yourself. The rapidity of American artillery reaction astonished German leaders who had studied artillery tactics extensively and considered themselves experts. German bombardment, regarded among the globe's finest based on decades of development and combat experience, could execute fire in 8 to 10 minutes under optimal circumstances with experienced crews. American bombardment routinely executed accurate fire in 3 minutes, a response time that seemed impossible by German standards, yet was consistently achieved across all theaters of operation. This velocity originated from numerous elements working in concert. American forward spotters utilized new FM transmitters that furnished clear, interference-free transmission even in difficult terrain and adverse weather conditions. German troops still depended primarily on AM transmitters plagued by static, interference from terrain features, and vulnerability to atmospheric conditions. American transmitters were also considerably more plentiful, issued down to company level in quantities that seemed wasteful by German standards. Every infantry battalion possessed multiple radio-equipped forward spotters capable of independently calling for fire. German battalions typically possessed 1 or 2 transmitters, frequently shared between units through elaborate scheduling systems. The forward spotters themselves constituted another American benefit that multiplied the effectiveness of the entire system. German forward spotters were artillery commanders, frequently deficient in infantry instruction or background, viewing battles from an artilleryman's perspective. American forward spotters were specially instructed personnel who grasped both bombardment and infantry methods through integrated training programs. They advanced with infantry formations, resided with infantry warriors sharing their dangers and hardships, and synchronized fire as an incorporated element of combined arms maneuvers rather than as a separate supporting function. Furthermore, American artillery spotters could summon an entire corps artillery, not merely their own battalion, a capability that represented a fundamental difference in military organization and doctrine. The apparatus permitted a solitary forward spotter, perhaps a lieutenant or captain, to synchronize fire from numerous batteries within minutes, bringing to bear firepower that exceeded what a German regimental commander could marshal. A lieutenant requesting fire assistance could unleash the mass of metal comparable to a modest air attack, executed more precisely and more swiftly than any air assistance could furnish. Oberst Heinrich Mueller, leader of an infantry regiment annihilated near St. Lo in July 1944 during the breakout from Normandy, recorded this capability in his concluding report written shortly before his death in subsequent fighting. A solitary American infantry company encircled in a settlement detained my complete regiment for 6 hours, frustrating every attempt to overrun their position. Each occasion we tried to charge. Bombardment fire repelled us with devastating accuracy. Not from one battery, but from what appeared like numerous batteries firing in coordination. The forward spotter with that company, likely a lieutenant or captain commanding perhaps 120 men, controlled more destructive power than I could deploy with my complete regimental bombardment of 12 guns. We sacrificed 400 personnel attempting to overwhelm those 120 Americans trapped in rubble. We failed utterly. The bombardment weapons themselves illustrated American industrial dominance and manufacturing sophistication. The M2A1 105mm howitzer, the typical American light bombardment weapon issued to every division, was a wonder of engineering and production that represented the best of American manufacturing capability. Rock Island Arsenal had mastered manufacturing methods that enabled swift production to exact tolerances, ensuring that every weapon performed identically regardless of which factory produced it. By World War II's conclusion, 8,536 M2A1 howitzers had been manufactured, a production figure that exceeded Germany's entire artillery inventory. Each American infantry division possessed 36 of these howitzers arranged into 3 battalions of 12 weapons each, providing divisional commanders with organic fire support that didn't require requesting assistance from higher headquarters. These battalions were completely motorized, hauled by trucks or half-tracks that could travel at highway velocities on roads or cross-country when necessary. Relocation from one firing location to another, an operation that required German horse-drawn bombardment 2 to 3 hours under ideal conditions, required American motorized batteries 20 to 30 minutes. This mobility advantage allowed American artillery to keep pace with rapidly advancing mechanized forces. The distinction in movement was dramatic and affected every aspect of artillery employment. German bombardment remained predominantly horse-drawn throughout the conflict, despite Hitler's obsession with mechanization and the propaganda images of sleek panzer divisions. Despite Nazi propaganda displaying mechanized panzer divisions racing across Europe, roughly 80% of German transportation relied on horses for movement, a fact carefully concealed from both the German public and foreign observers. Germany commenced World War II with 514,000 horses and concluded with 1,198,000 by February 1945, expanding its horse inventory even as its mechanized forces contracted. This increasing reliance on animal transport reflected industrial capacity limitations rather than strategic choice. Each German bombardment weapon demanded 6 to 8 horses for transport and required hours to harness, transport, and unharness in an exhausting process that wore out both men and animals. In winter circumstances with frozen ground, deep snow, and numbing cold, movement became nearly unachievable. Horses struggled in the cold, consuming enormous quantities of fodder that was increasingly difficult to supply. Gefreiter Paul Richter, assigned to a German bombardment battery in Normandy, maintained a comprehensive diary that survived the conflict and provides remarkable insight into the daily frustrations of German artillerymen. We observed American bombardment relocate during combat, executing a maneuver we had been taught required careful planning and significant time. They launched their assignment, firing perhaps a dozen rounds, then trucks materialized as if summoned by magic. Within 20 minutes, the complete battery had harnessed their weapons and departed, leaving behind nothing but empty shell casings and tire tracks. We demanded 2 hours minimum to accomplish the identical operation, and that presumed favorable climate and routes. In mud or under attack when every minute counted, we might require 4 hours or more. The Americans would establish at a fresh location and be prepared to launch again before we had completed relocating. We were conducting a 19th century conflict with horses against an adversary, conducting a 20th century conflict with trucks and internal combustion engines. The result was unavoidable from the start. American 155mm howitzers furnished even more crushing fire assistance for particularly difficult targets. Each division possessed 12 M1 155mm howitzers in a distinct battalion, providing heavy fire support capability organic to the division. These weapons launching 43-kilogram projectiles, nearly 100 pounds of high-explosive steel, to distances exceeding 14,000 meters furnished the division leader with a powerful strike, capable of demolishing fortifications that would withstand smaller caliber fire. Concrete bunkers, reinforced buildings, prepared defensive positions that could resist 105mm fire were vulnerable to 155mm shells. The 155mm was itself a triumph of engineering that balanced power, mobility, and reliability. Created in the late 1930s by a team of ordnance engineers and standardized in May 1941, after extensive testing, it merged distance, precision, and dependability in a single platform. 10,300 were manufactured during the conflict by multiple contractors across the United States. The weapon could be hauled at highway velocities by a truck or half-track, enabling swift relocation that kept pace with mobile warfare. Launch rate was 4 rounds per minute sustained. Though expertly instructed, crews could momentarily accomplish 6 rounds per minute during critical missions. Yet even these divisional resources dimmed beside the bombardment accessible at Corps and Army magnitude, where truly heavy artillery was concentrated. American Corps bombardment typically contained battalions of 155mm weapons, 8-inch howitzers capable of demolishing any field fortification, and even enormous 240mm howitzers that fired shells weighing 360 pounds. These armaments capable of demolishing any fortification could be summoned by forward spotters at battalion magnitude through the integrated fire control system. The multiplication of destructive power signified a solitary rifle company. The smallest tactical unit with organic fire support capability could within minutes unleash fire from divisional, corps, and even Army bombardment. A concentration of firepower that was unprecedented in military history. German bombardment, by comparison, was inflexibly arranged according to doctrines developed in the 1930s. Corps and Army bombardment were distinct commands operating under separate headquarters, not accessible to assist divisional maneuvers without substantial synchronization and authorization through multiple headquarters, a process that consumed precious time. German infantry divisions possessed their own bombardment organized into regimental artillery battalions, but summoning fire from Corps' bombardment demanded routing petitions through division to Corps to Army, frequently requiring hours for authorization as each headquarters evaluated the request. By the occasion, fire materialized. If it materialized at all, American mobile conflict had shifted the battle line, rendering the fire support irrelevant. Lieutenant Joachim Weber, a forward spotter who had petitioned Corps bombardment assistance during the Normandy operation in what he considered a textbook case requiring heavy fire support, recorded his exasperation in letters later discovered. I summoned Corps bombardment at 09:15 hours after observing enemy tanks massing for a counterattack. The adversary was assembling tanks for a charge on our location. 12 Sherman tanks supported by infantry. I furnished exact references using proper artillery terminology, depicted the objective with precision based on my training, clarified the tactical circumstance emphasizing the urgency. At 13:30 hours, 4 hours afterward when the crisis had long passed, I ultimately obtained fire. 3 salvos, perhaps 36 rounds total. By that moment, the American tanks had finished their charge and retreated, having overrun our forward positions. Our location was overrun. I survived solely by fortune, hiding in rubble as American infantry swept past. The Corps bombardment, which might have rescued us and stopped the attack, materialized too delayed to signify anything except wasted ammunition. The technical advancement of American bombardment extended to the ammunition itself, where quality control and standardization reached levels Germany never achieved. While Germany struggled with propellant deficiencies caused by blockades restricting access to raw materials and irregular projectile manufacturing as factories were bombed and relocated, American industry furnished ammunition in seemingly boundless quantities produced to exact specifications that guaranteed consistent functioning. Every shell performed identically, allowing gunners to trust their firing tables absolutely. More notably, the Americans deployed the variable time fuse, universally known as the VT fuse, a technological wonder that would prove critical and represented one of the most significant technological achievements of the war. The VT fuse, also termed the proximity fuse, housed a miniature radar transmitter and receiver in the projectile's nose, an engineering achievement that required miniaturizing vacuum tube technology to withstand the enormous acceleration forces of artillery launch. The transmitter broadcast a radio pulse continuously as the shell flew toward its target. When the projectile neared the terrain or any object, the reflected pulse activated detonation at precisely the optimal altitude. The outcome was a projectile that detonated at ideal elevation for maximum lethality, typically 10 to 20 meters above terrain, creating a cone of fragments that swept the ground below. The VT fuse revolutionized bombardment effectiveness in ways that were immediately apparent to anyone who witnessed its effects. Traditional time fuses demanded computing the exact duration to objective, then adjusting the fuse correspondingly before loading, a process requiring calculation and manual adjustment for each round. Wind, temperature, barrel deterioration from repeated firing all influenced projectile flight duration in ways that were difficult to predict precisely. Even minor miscalculations signified projectiles detonating too elevated to be effective or burying themselves in terrain before detonation, wasting the explosive force. The VT fuse removed these factors entirely, ensuring ideal air explosion regardless of circumstances. It was immune to wind, temperature variations, barrel wear, and operator error in fuse setting. The VT fuse had initially been utilized in combat by the USS Helena on January 5, 1943, destroying a Japanese dive bomber off Guadalcanal with merely 2 to 3 salvos in what was considered a remarkable demonstration of the technology's potential. Throughout 1943 and 1944, VT fuses proved crushingly successful in naval anti-aircraft maneuvers and against V-1 flying bombs over England, destroying hundreds of the pilotless aircraft. Nevertheless, worries about the technology falling into German possession prevented its utilization in ground bombardment over Europe, where shells might be recovered unexploded. Security was so tight that even knowledge of the fuse's existence was highly classified. General Dwight Eisenhower personally petitioned authorization to employ VT fuses during the Bulge battle, contending in urgent communications with Washington that their effectiveness warranted the security hazard given the desperate tactical situation. The Pentagon initially declined, concerned about technology compromise. Eisenhower objected intensely, arguing that the fuses could save American lives and defeat the German offensive. Official authorization arrived on December 19th through 21st, 1944, shortly after the German attack commenced and the full scope of the crisis became apparent. This designated the initial utilization of VT fuses against ground forces in the European theater, a decision that would prove decisive. The judgment proved accurate beyond even optimistic predictions. VT-fused projectiles devastated German formations seized in the open during the Ardennes attack, inflicting casualties at rates that exceeded anything previously achieved by artillery. Naval anti-aircraft examinations had demonstrated VT fuses were 3 to 4 times more successful than traditional fuses against V-1 flying bombs, and ground combat confirmed these ratios. VT fuses demolished 79% of all approaching objectives in controlled tests. The lethal fragment zone was 3,000 square feet versus 60 square feet for traditional fuses, a 50-fold increase in effective lethal area. Some calculations suggested VT fuses enhanced bombardment effectiveness by 200 to 700%, depending on target type and terrain. Forces who had mastered surviving traditional bombardment by finding any depression in terrain discovered that VT fuses negated such shelter completely. The projectiles detonated above them at precisely calculated altitude, raining downward with deadly shrapnel that struck personnel prone in shallow depressions from above. Obergefreiter Hans Mueller, whose diary initiated this narrative, endured a VT fuse bombardment and documented his ordeal in entries written with trembling hands. We had mastered on the Eastern Front to flatten at the initial explosion, dropping instantly to the ground at the first warning. Even shallow depressions provided protection from shrapnel traveling horizontally, and we had learned to read terrain for these small advantages. But these projectiles, these demon projectiles as we labeled them, detonated above us regardless of cover. The shrapnel descended like precipitation, like deadly rain falling from the sky. Personnel in foxholes, personnel who should have been protected by overhead and position, were eliminated by shrapnel that descended vertically into their holes. There was no protection except deep bunkers with thick overhead cover, and we possessed no duration to excavate deep bunkers in frozen ground. We merely perished, helpless against this new terror. The mental impact of VT fuses intensified their physical consequences in ways that affected unit cohesion and combat effectiveness. German warriors instructed to respond to bombardment by finding shelter discovered their instruction irrelevant, their hard-won experience useless. The awareness that no shelter short of overhead protection would rescue them produced paralysis and combat refusal. Some formations declined to depart defensive locations, even under explicit orders from officers threatening court-martial, because movement in the open signified certain death if American bombardment engaged them. Hauptmann Friedrich Bauer recorded a near rebellion in his formation during the concluding weeks of the Ardennes attack that illustrated the psychological collapse VT fuses induced. My company was commanded to charge an American location 300 meters distant across open ground, a straightforward tactical maneuver we had executed successfully dozens of times. The personnel declined outright, refusing to leave their positions. They had witnessed what American bombardment accomplished to forces in the open, particularly with these novel fuses that exploded in air. I attempted to clarify that we would perish anyway if we didn't charge, that remaining in position simply delayed the inevitable, that the Americans would ultimately overrun our location with their inevitable advance. The personnel wouldn't advance regardless of threats or appeals. They favored the possibility of seizure to the certainty of death under American bombardment fire. I couldn't blame them, having witnessed the same horrors myself. The industrial capability that manufactured American bombardment and ammunition in such quantities constituted another dimension of dominance that German warriors couldn't grasp, couldn't reconcile with their understanding of industrial capacity. Rock Island Arsenal alone manufactured over 10,000 105mm howitzers, a single facility producing more artillery pieces than some nations fielded in their entire armed forces. Multiple facilities manufactured 155mm howitzers and heavier armaments across the United States. Projectile manufacturing reached staggering magnitudes throughout the conflict, with production measured in millions of rounds monthly. German manufacturing, hindered by Allied bombing that destroyed factories and killed skilled workers, resource deficiencies caused by blockade and overextension, and inefficient distribution of industrial capability, never neared American magnitudes, despite desperate efforts to increase production. German bombardment weapons were frequently superior in construction to their American equivalents, demonstrating better engineering in some respects, but Germany manufactured them in inadequate numbers and deficient the industrial capability to sustain manufacturing as the conflict progressed and demands increased. By 1944, German bombardment batteries frequently functioned at half capacity, with weapons demolished or exhausted from excessive firing, and no substitutes accessible from depleted factories. More critically, German ammunition manufacturing couldn't maintain intensive maneuvers of the type required in modern warfare. German bombardment batteries were frequently restricted to minimal daily allocations, sometimes as minimal as 2 to 3 projectiles per weapon per day, barely enough for registration fire, much less sustained fire support. American batteries confronted no such limitations whatsoever. Forward spotters could summon fire freely without concern for ammunition expenditure, recognizing that ammunition provision was effectively boundless. This freedom transformed tactical options. Lieutenant Werner Vogel, a German bombardment commander responsible for supporting an infantry regiment, recorded the ammunition emergency in his conflict diary with mounting frustration. We obtained 50 projectiles per weapon for the complete week, 50 rounds to assist an infantry regiment of 2,000 men confronting continuous American charges. 50 rounds for 7 days, barely 7 rounds per gun per day. I was obligated to warrant each fire assignment to battalion headquarters, clarifying why this specific objective merited expenditure of irreplaceable ammunition, filling out forms even as infantry called desperately for fire support. Meanwhile, American bombardment launched thousands of projectiles daily with no evident concern for preservation, firing for effect whenever targets presented themselves. We conducted a poor man's conflict against a wealthy man's adversary, and poverty eventually defeats wealth's enemy. The disparity in ammunition provision manifested in tactical philosophy at the most fundamental level. German bombardment philosophy emphasized concentrated fire on high-value objectives executed solely after meticulous planning and authorization through headquarters, artillery used as a scarce resource. American philosophy emphasized responsive fire immediately accessible to assist infantry maneuvers, artillery as an abundant resource to be employed liberally. An American infantry platoon commander could petition and obtain bombardment assistance within minutes through his company commander, who had direct communication with fire support coordination. A German platoon commander might wait hours for fire if he obtained any at all, his request climbing through battalion, regiment, and division before reaching artillery headquarters. The logistics of ammunition provision further highlighted American benefits that extended beyond mere production. American bombardment was completely motorized, provisioned by truck convoys that could furnish thousands of projectiles to forward locations within hours of requests being transmitted. German bombardment, horse-drawn and frequently dependent on rail transport for long-distance movement of heavy ammunition, struggled to sustain adequate forward reserves as logistics chains extended. As Allied air power interdicted German rail systems through systematic bombing of marshalling yards, bridges, and locomotives, ammunition provision became progressively difficult and eventually approached impossibility in many sectors. American logistics also profited from standardization that simplified supply chains. The M1 projectile launched by 105mm howitzers utilized the identical fuse as projectiles launched by 155mm howitzers and larger calibers, a design decision that simplified inventory management enormously. This standardization simplified provision, diminished inventory demands, and guaranteed that fuses were constantly accessible regardless of which caliber weapon required them. German ammunition manufacturing, afflicted by multiple fuse constructions and caliber variants developed by different designers and factories, suffered chronic deficiencies of specific components, even when overall manufacturing remained sufficient. Right fuses unavailable for available shells, or vice versa. The dominance of American bombardment generated a cascading consequence on German tactical alternatives that left commanders with no good choices. German leaders, recognizing that concentrating forces would attract crushing bombardment fire observed from the air, dispersed their formations across wider frontages. But dispersed formations deficient combat strength and could be defeated piecemeal by concentrated American attacks. Concentrated forces could produce combat strength for offensive operations, but became objectives for American bombardment. Either selection led to defeat eventually, dispersal guaranteed weakness, concentration guaranteed destruction. The Ardennes attack, Germany's concluding major charge in the West illustrated these dynamics with brutal precision that left no doubt about American artillery superiority. German planning relied on fog and overcast climate to neutralize American air power, the one element they correctly assessed. The planners accurately evaluated that American aircraft couldn't function in adverse climate with low ceilings. They failed to grasp that American bombardment didn't demand favorable climate, operated effectively regardless of weather, and was guided by ground observers who could function in any conditions. During the initial days of the attack, when German forces achieved their deepest penetrations, German armored and infantry divisions secured substantial penetrations against surprised American positions held by inexperienced troops who had been resting in what was considered a quiet sector. Over 200,000 German forces and roughly 1,000 tanks initiated the initial charge on December 16, 1944, achieving the surprise that German planning had counted on. Then, American artillery located them through the systematic grid search techniques practiced in countless training exercises. Deficient the movement to swiftly relocate when engaged under fire due to horse transport limitations, German horse-drawn bombardment batteries were demolished in position as American counter-battery fire found them. Deficient the ammunition reserves to participate in sustained counter-battery fire against American positions, German weapons fell quiet after brief engagements while American weapons continued to launch without pause, hour after hour. Stabsfeldwebel Kurt Zimmermann, whose diary furnishes extensive detail on German bombardment maneuvers during the Bulge from an experienced non-commissioned officer's perspective, documented the disparity with mounting despair. Our battery was positioned in woods south of St. Vith, carefully concealed under trees with camouflage nets. We possessed 50 projectiles per weapon. Our complete allocation for the maneuver meant to last for the operation's duration. We launched an assignment in assistance of our infantry attacking American positions. Within 10 minutes of ceasing fire, American counter-battery fire demolished 3 of our 6 weapons and eliminated most of the horses with terrifying precision. We attempted to relocate the remaining weapons according to standard doctrine, but deficient horses to transport them, the surviving animals panicked by the bombardment. We abandoned the weapons where they stood and retreated on foot through the snow. This was the sequence across the complete front as battery after battery was silenced. Our bombardment was silenced, while American bombardment continued to launch without pause, responding to targets as they appeared. At Bastogne, the surrounded American garrison that became symbolic of American resistance, American bombardment ammunition was actually limited to solely 10 rounds per weapon per day on December 22nd due to deficiencies caused by the siege-cutting supply routes. Despite this constraint that would have paralyzed German operations, American bombardment proved critical in shattering German charges around the encircled town as gunners carefully chose their targets. When the climate cleared after Christmas, allowing aerial resupply, provision resumed and American bombardment fire intensified dramatically as stockpiles were rebuilt. During the complete Bulge operation lasting from mid-December through January, 4,155 American weapons launched 1,255,000 bombardment rounds, an average of more than 300 rounds per weapon, a figure that exceeded German ammunition production for the entire army during the same period. German formations that had penetrated 50 kilometers into American lines during the opening days discovered themselves trapped, encircled by American troops that could summon boundless bombardment assistance once resupply resumed after the weather cleared. Oberst Heinrich Mueller, whose regiment had been annihilated at Saint-Lô 6 months earlier, and who now commanded a hastily assembled replacement regiment during the Bulge, led his men forward in the attack. His concluding report, composed in a prisoner-of-war facility after his seizure in January 1945, when resistance finally collapsed, furnishes a stark evaluation from a professional officer who had witnessed the complete transformation of warfare. We were defeated by American bombardment before we were defeated by American infantry or armor. The battle was lost to artillery before it was ever contested by ground forces. Every movement we executed was spotted by their aircraft flying overhead with impunity and engaged by their bombardment with precision we couldn't counter. Every concentration of forces we attempted was disrupted by bombardment fire before we could charge. Our assault formations shattered before they advanced. Every defensive location was demolished by bombardment before their infantry assaulted, leaving us with no prepared positions. We couldn't advance because movement drew fire, couldn't concentrate because masses drew fire, couldn't protect because fixed positions drew fire. We merely absorbed bombardment fire until we terminated as an effective force capable of combat operations. The attack, planned to drive through to Ant,